Well, after being pushed to an unwinnable position by the Liberal Party at this year's federal election on the Senate ticket, but then going ahead and receiving a record-breaking 130,000 first preference votes under the line, former Liberal Senator Jim Molan now appears to be in the running to return to the upper house following the resignation of Arthur Sinodinos, who last week confirmed a departure date of November. A retired Major General and recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, Molan already has the endorsement of the Prime Minister Scott Morrison. And it's been reported today that the right faction of the party, the Liberal Party in New South Wales, similarly backs his run. Now, I've asked Jim Molan on tonight to discuss the events of yesterday in Hong Kong, where a young protester was shot in the chest by police, with live ammunition now being used by authorities, as well as the mighty show of military strength by China in its parade to commemorate 70 years of Communist Party rule. But you can better ask about the Senate run as well. Jim Molan joins me now from Sydney. Jim, terrific to have you on the show. I know you'll quote me all the usual rules about candidates and speaking out in the media about party politics. I know them inside out, but are you in the race?
Peter, it's good to have you back, and it's good to be back on the show again. Yes, I'm in the race. There's no two ways about it. But that's about the limit of all I can say at the moment. But I can speak in general about just one thing, and that is that we are about to lose a very, very good senator. Arthur Sinodinos has been a warrior for the Liberal cause as a staffer, as a chief of staff, and now as a senator for many, many years. And as you know better than anyone around the place, as soon as a government is elected, it's fighting the next election. And whoever is to replace Arthur must be able to support the Morrison government in defeating Labor in 2022. So, yes, I will put my name down, but that's the extent to which I can talk about that, I'm afraid, Peter.
All right, well, you were kinder than I would be about Arthur Sinodinos. I absolutely rate his time as Chief of Staff in the Howard government. I was the Chief of Staff for a minister, worked closely with him. But I can't seem to get past the fact that he turned up to all of those coup meetings to unseat Tony Abbott, who'd only just been elected, even though Abbott had backed him all the way through his ICAC business. But I'll let bygones be bygones. I want to move on to China. So you're in the race. Good luck, Jim. I suppose we'll talk to you after the decision. Just before we go actually to China, when do you think the ballot will be?
I think it will be whenever the annual general meeting is, which is about the second weekend of November, as far as I can tell.
All right. OK. Well, I'll not cruel your pitch and ask you too many more questions there and get you into trouble, because I know at New South Wales Liberal Party aficionados are like, China. I was fascinated last night to see some rushes of footage, and even more of it today. We'll put some of it on the screen for viewers. President Xi Jinping, look at that, head out of the top of the car in the limousine, faded in a way that only potentates and dictators, can I go that far, are faded. This was an enormous show of strength, and I think partly some of the criticism of China and the way in which it's basically held back a little bit from going in hard about the protests in Hong Kong, I think have been because they don't want to get in the way of this parade. I fear now that this parade is over, that the anniversary has occurred, things will change rapidly in Hong Kong. But you're a military man. Take us through some of the arsenal that we saw on display in the big streets of Beijing yesterday.
Yes, it was quite something, Peter, wasn't it? And as I watched it, I thought it was spectacular. I thought it was awesome. But I remember where I've seen this kind of parade before, and essentially it's a Warsaw Pact view of using your military in order to intimidate. And that intimidation might be faced at an internal crowd, or it might be faced at an audience which is external. And I think what we saw in China is both of these were the target. And we all know how much China has changed, how much it's developed and what it's doing. But what President Xi is saying to us all is, and he said it almost in specific words, is don't muck around with us. We are on our way. And in a lot of ways, the implication is stand aside. Now, we saw over the last couple of weeks a delegation from an Australian Studies Centre in China who used even more specific language than that. But there are two things that I'd say that struck me really about this parade. And that was, firstly, the rocket force that appeared, and secondly, one of their particular fighters that they displayed on those occasions. There were about 15,000 soldiers, I think. When I was in Indonesia, we used to see parades of 10,000. 15,000 is not that impressive, but every other part of this parade was impressive. I took some notes as I went through it, and certainly the rocket force, when I looked at it, it brought up the rear. The long-range rocket forces called the DF-41. There are about 12 units of this that I could count, and they brought up the parade, and that's the rocket that, should they ever want to use that again as an intercontinental ballistic missile, long-range rocket, that's the one they use. There was also a very snappy-looking rocket that I think was called the DF-100. It was more a medium-range rocket. It looked stealthy, which means you shouldn't be able to see it all that easily as it comes towards you, and that's really for ground and medium targets. But what I also thought was something that we should all look at was the fifth-generation fighters that they had. You might have seen a fly past of helicopters and other things, and the fifth-generation fighters, the Chengdu J-20, followed up that, and I counted about 7 or 8, two flights of about 7 or 8 aircraft. This is a big aeroplane and a powerful aeroplane, and it's probably at least as good, and some say better, than the best American aeroplane, the J-22.
Yeah, the discipline was evident there, the discipline of the crowds, the choreographing, the goose-stepping of the soldiers. I mean, you have seen Chinese parades, as I have. You've seen parades around the world in other countries. There's not, I mean, Britain certainly has pageantry, but there's nothing like the precision of a Chinese military parade when you see them live and in person. It was pretty phenomenal yesterday. Tell me about the message this was meant to send to Hong Kong.
Oh, I think this is where it's going to get very, very complicated. And we saw yesterday events in Hong Kong pitch over a certain area where they used live ammunition. And in some senses, I can understand the police. The police were cornered, were being intimidated directly, and a live round was fired. I don't think necessarily it'll mean that tomorrow, and there's 7 days of this week of the 70th anniversary, I don't think tomorrow the People's Liberation Army, which is not a Chinese army, it is a Chinese Communist Party army, or the auxiliary police will come roaring across the border and save the whole thing. I think that for a period of time they will still try to neutralise the activists, because I would suspect that the people in Hong Kong who are not activists at the moment will be getting very, very sick of this, and they'll be hoping that they put pressure on the activists to change and go back to a prosperous, quiet, capitalist Hong Kong. So I'm not too sure where this will go, but at some stage we all know that Chinese patience, if it runs out, they can act, and they can act very, very quickly, and we should be very concerned about the human rights aspects of the actions that they take.
All right, I want to get to some issues closer to home, but before we do, there's been a bit of a debate. There's 66-odd Australian women and children formally involved in the ISIS campaign. I don't like to call them jihadi brides, because I think it's just as likely these are female terrorists until someone can prove otherwise. I think the children obviously get the benefit of the doubt. There is calls from international organisations for Australia to repatriate these women and children here. The Prime Minister, I might have a grab from an interview he did this afternoon with David Spears, but the Prime Minister hasn't been swayed by commentary from overseas. This is what the Prime Minister said.
Our response to this is a careful one. We have a regime, thankfully now in place, that we're able to have legislated for temporary exclusion orders, which are designed to protect Australians and to protect our national interests. And they will be applied based on assessments of each and every individual case. Secondly, I'm not going to put one Australian in harm's way to facilitate people's return.
All right, Jim, you know Iraq and this region better than anybody. Is the Prime Minister right?
Oh, I think he's absolutely right on this. And I was in the Parliamentary Joint Committee Intelligence and Security when we went through the temporary exclusion order legislation. And this is a good use of this legislation. And we can be bleeding heart and we can be humane without putting at risk Australian citizens. So the mechanisms are there. This is not something that we should rush into, because if we rush into it on an emotional basis, then who's going to pay in the future? Quite possibly innocent Australians may pay for this in the future. So we've got to be guarded and do this correctly.
Another issue, again, you've got a lot of experience in the issue of Operation Sovereign Borders, but we have a Tamil family being rejected by the High Court, we know, 7 times over, trying now with their youngest daughter to remain in Australia. They are on Christmas Island. Peter Dutton has said they are not in detention. They have the run of the island. As we know, there are no one in detention on Christmas Island, so they are held there with locals and other sort of officials and workers. But their lawyer has written to the United Nations in an attempt to get the United Nations involved to plead with Australia that they are returned to the mainland, possibly even to Billawheeler. The government's holding firm. They say no, not while the court case is underway. They should go, that's the view of the Australian government, as you know, back to Sri Lanka, and it all hinges on this young daughter. What sort of signal is this sending, this constant debate about this particular family, to people smugglers? And we've seen since the May election a number of boats leave Sri Lanka in particular. What sort of signal is being sent around our region, do you think, Jim?
I don't think that the signal that's going to the region is the kind of signal that will, at the moment, that will create an avalanche of boats coming towards us, either from Java or from Sri Lanka. It depends how we now react. We all know that what makes sovereign borders work, what means that gives us the support of the Australian people in the very generous immigration policy that we have, what makes this work is government resolve, and that's what we're seeing. We don't take that out on an individual family. The fortune of this individual family is that, like every other Australian, they are subject to the rule of law. Let the rule of law work through, and let's not pray we're not saddled with activist judges.
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right. But it will be watched very closely, and we don't know how long this court case could run. Peter Dutton seemed to think it could even go into next year. Well, Jim Molan, I won't ask you again about the Senate, other than to say, you know, this is a pretty good audition for Australian voters as to why you should be back in the upper house in Canberra. So good luck with your campaign, and thanks very much for your insights tonight.